Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Pro Peace Report. This will be the first debate-ish kind of podcast I'm doing. It'll be a discussion and a debate. And so the guest today is a DSA member from Michigan. We had an exchange on Twitter about forced to vote for Medicare for all. We had a discussion about DSA and working within the Democratic Party or working within a third party. And he challenged me to talk about it on stream, and so now we're going to do it. And so here is Stephen James. Stephen, how are you doing?
How are you doing today, man?
Pretty good. Still procrastinating a paper I have to write by Friday, but it's going okay.
Yep.
What about you?
I'm doing pretty solid. Bit tired. Had to work late last night, but it's all good.
Nice. So tell us about yourself. So what is your political worldview? What's your involvement with DSA, and what's your electoral worldview also?
I consider myself a socialist. I don't necessarily strictly fit myself into one category. I think there's a lot of very quality ideas on the left, a wide range of ideas that are infinitely better than the system we live in now. I've been a DSA member for 3 years. I've had fairly limited involvement when it comes to chapter stuff, so local stuff, but I have done quite a bit with the national organization. Anytime there's phone banking or text banking opportunities, I take those. Anytime there's a candidate in my area who is DSA endorsed, I usually take the time to text bank, phone bank, and occasionally door knock for them. During the Bernie campaign in 2020, I volunteered for him. In 2018, Abdul Sayed, who is a progressive who was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and most of the squad, as people call them, who ran for governor here in Michigan, I also volunteered on his campaign. So I am a firm believer, clearly, in elections and reform. And yeah.
Okay. So now I'll just say a little bit about myself. Yeah. So I am somebody who's always believed in making a third party. So ever since I was 14, we had a high school assignment. In 2012, we had to pick a presidential candidate to cover in that assignment. And so I picked a third party candidate. I think I picked Gary Johnson at the time, only person in my class who covered a third party candidate. And that's what I thought. I was libertarian. I've always been on the edge of liberal and libertarian.
Right.
Then 2015 came around. My friend told me about Bernie Sanders. First I heard of him. Was very inspired by his campaign in 2016. That's kind of what made me come around to democratic socialism at the time. And so I volunteered for Bernie at his DC campaign office one time. I went to some of his rallies, did a little bit of phone banking. He lost. And so at the time he lost, I actually had protested at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia with Democracy Spring.
Yeah.
So we were protesting for democracy reforms, so money out of politics, get rid of superdelegates, open primaries, things like that. Actually got arrested as civil disobedience there. And that while we were there, the news broke that the Democratic Party was not fair in their primary with Bernie, that there was all sorts of collusion going on between the media and the Democratic Party and the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party. And so at that time, I actually moved from, supporting the Democrats as the lesser of two evils to voting Green Party. I voted for Jill Stein in 2016. But after the election, I was very disappointed that Bernie didn't come out against the Democrats. I wished he had used the moment to break the Democratic Party, break the two-party system entirely, but he didn't. And so I had stayed with one foot in the Green Party and one foot in the Bernie Sanders 2020 strategy. So then 2020 comes around. I had done some protests in between with Extinction Rebellion in DC. I went to a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. But then 2020 came around. I supported Bernie again. I wasn't actually as actively involved this time. I should have been. But then he lost. And at that point, I was completely done with the Democratic Party. I wasn't there. Supporting Joe Biden wasn't even something on my radar. I supported Howie Hawkins, was under no illusion that Howie Hawkins was going to win or anything like that.
That's good, at least.
Yeah. It's just that for me, I don't want to give my vote to the Democratic Party, to somebody like Biden, who's telling me he's going to veto Medicare for all and things like that.
Sure.
But so then he gets elected. The Black Lives Matter protests in DC started slowing down at that point because I had been going, 5, 10, 15 times.
Sure.
They started slowing down. A lot of people stopped coming out in December of 2020. And we actually all got attacked by the Proud Boys in December. And because the crowds didn't show up like they did before, because, Biden put people to sleep, you could say, we were outnumbered. And then January comes around. This is where we can kind of start talking about forced to vote.
Yeah.
January comes around, and I had always thought when I supported AOC, because I did support AOC originally. Yeah. I did support all the squad originally. I thought that they were going to be more oppositional to the Democratic Party. I thought that they would act as like a left-wing bloc within the Democratic Party, but trying to take it over and antagonizing within. Mm-hmm. But when they all immediately supported Nancy Pelosi, who has a 30-40% approval rating, Medicare for All is like 60%, when they were not willing to withhold their votes to get Medicare for All because it was going to fail, that to me made it seem like they were appeasing the Democratic Party. And then, the AOC abstaining on a vote to defund Capitol Police, abstaining on the Iron Dome, things like that, all conglomerated to make me distrust their strategy of working within even more. And I was already on the outside strategy. I was not in the inside strategy, really. But the benefit of the doubt I had given them, I was losing it at that point.
Okay. So are you aware of the explanation AOC gave as to why she didn't support force the vote? Because she did eventually address it, and the explanation made sense to me. So back in 2017, force the vote basically did happen with Medicare for All. And what happened is people like Kamala Harris were co-sponsors of the bill because they knew ultimately that Medicare for All wouldn't pass the House, wouldn't pass the Senate. So if for somebody like Kamala, who knew she was going to be running for president, she decided to make it her own personal branding project. And that was the concern that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that she had, doing the same thing again, where you have people who don't actually believe in this, who haven't actually been fighting for this for the last, 10, 15, 20 years, or people like Bernie for 50, 60 years. It's people who are going to take advantage of the situation just to put their name next to something that's popular, even if they don't actually support it. So,
but I guess for me, it's like they're already doing that when it comes to co-sponsoring the bill. I'm sure some of those 117 don't genuinely support
I agree.
the bill.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But to me, it's like it's still good to have them force them to put it on paper that they support this single-payer Medicare for All bill, because a co-sponsor is not the same as we're having a national vote now. There's media coverage surrounding it. It has a moment for a few weeks or whatever it is. If they have to put their names down, then it's going to be much harder when they backpedal. Because I know Kamala backpedaled.
Yeah.
Because when Kamala backpedaled, she went from saying we shouldn't have private insurance to saying, oh, well, actually, Medicare for All doesn't mean getting rid of private insurance, which we both know that's not what the bill actually means. It does mean getting rid of private insurance.
Correct.
And so it's like, to me, it makes them look like flip-floppers if the people who don't genuinely believe in it support it now just because it's a for show type of thing, like you're saying, like AOC had said, it's just for show. Mm-hmm. But if they backpedal after that, then we can expose them because, hey, look, they said they supported this bill. And now, because let's imagine it doesn't pass, right? And the flip-floppers supported it the first time. Mm-hmm. Now we're 3 years, 4 years down the road, whatever it is. Now the bill has enough numbers to pass, right? But we have one or two people who don't vote for it who voted for it last time. Right. Now all of a sudden you go, look, those people said they supported this thing and they don't. That's when you expose them. But if we have people vote against it now, if we have the vote in January and people vote against it now, then we see at least who has voted against it. Not the ones who are pretending to symbolically support it, the ones who voted against it. And then we either primary them or, in my opinion, run a third-party candidate against them.
Sure, but the problem with the strategy like that is ultimately you're just muddying the waters more.
They're the ones muddying the waters, though.
Well, it's one of those things where anything that's going to cause extra confusion. So having people like Kamala Harris backing Medicare for All, at one point backing things like 4-year tuition-free college, backing these fairly progressive policies. Now she is in power. And there is probably a group of voters who associate Kamala Harris with all of those policies and with all of those beliefs and all of those values because she backed these bills and she campaigned on these very progressive policies. And now she is in a position of power. Same thing with Joe Biden. And ultimately, that just harms our cause more when we're trying to educate people on these policies, when we're trying to get these policies passed, and we have people who don't actually care about getting those policies in place in highest positions of power. It's just muddying the waters more. And if we did something like this, there's just nothing to gain from it. We already know who does and doesn't support Medicare for all. Sure, there's probably a few people in that co-sponsor list who don't actually support Medicare for all, and we'll figure that out down the line. But this ultimately, people know what Medicare for all is. People know what universal health care is. We don't need more publicity. We need to focus on getting people in office who are actually going to pass the bill.
And so in terms of like the muddying the waters part, that's a problem that we're going to have whether we force the vote now or whether the vote happens 4 years from now. Whenever the vote happens, there will be people in who muddy the waters. Like that's 100%. Inevitable. That's just kind of the centrist, corporate, neoliberal approach to things. They're always going to say they support the thing, and then they're going to pull an Elizabeth Warren or they're going to pull a Kamala Harris, and they're going to portray it differently. So I think that will always happen.
Sure.
But in terms of it not being beneficial, I take the Brianna Joy Gray stance on it, where it's like, I think having the media attention on it, creating a policy window where, because now what's happening now, we have Medicare expansion that is going to be taken out of the reconciliation bill potentially. And the Medicare expansion for eyes, vision, and hearing, that was already a compromise on a compromise on a compromise on a compromise.
Yeah, no,
so
and
the thing is,
they shouldn't.
If we had had a moment in January or February where we created a policy window where they were going to block Nancy Pelosi, the media would have to cover it for one, and they'd be smearing us left and right. I guarantee it. But if they had come out of the gates fighting for Medicare for all, we'd likely, this Medicare expansion, it'd be like a guaranteed shoo-in for the bill, because for the past 10 months during a pandemic that's killed 750,000 people, they'd have been consistently fighting for what they really want, not Biden's Build Back Better agenda like Pramila Jayapal. Pramila Jayapal called him the inspirer-in-chief, the closer. I mean, it's like they're appeasing the powerful. They're appeasing the people that we disagree with. And that's why we get rolled when Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema don't appease them in the same way.
So the reality of the situation is that the original Build Back Better agenda was a $10 trillion spending plan that would have been the biggest increase of the social safety net.
But she said this last week.
Right.
She said this after it's already been gutted.
Well, I wanna just give some context. So the original Build Back Better plan was pretty good. Like, it would have been the biggest improvement to the average person's life in American history, just in one bill. But that was a year ago when it was at a $10 trillion bill. And now it looks like it's going to be less than 2. And it's not great. The reason for it, though, isn't the majority of Democratic senators. The reason for it is 50 Republican senators and 2 very centrist corporate sellouts. Those people are the ones that we should be focusing our attention on. We know that Republicans and us will never agree on 99% of things. They will never support any of our bills, any of our policies. We know, though, with Democrats, we'll get at least a little bit. So that's something. That is a start. So if we can just get more Democratic senators in there, and we can get things like a public option. A public option is an improvement, right? For something like Medicare, that is an improvement from where we are now. If we can get marijuana legalized, if we can get these small improvements to improve people's lives in the meantime, while we're still building this leftist coalition within the Democratic Party through DSA and through these other organizations, seems like we're going to be making progress.
But that doesn't respond to the idea of, if we don't pressure our own 117 co-sponsors who should be fighting harder, who shouldn't be appeasing Joe Biden and saying that they support Joe Biden's agenda and they're not stepping out of line and they're not pressuring it. We elected these people to fight for Medicare for all. And because they started the year from a position of, oh, we're not supporting Medicare for all, we're backing Biden's agenda. Then Biden backpedals from the public option. He doesn't even support the public option this year. And so now, and Joe Biden even this week has said that because Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin aren't supporting Medicare expansion, it's not realistic.
I mean, it's not. It won't pass.
Joe Biden. They should be out there hammering their centrists in their party, but they're only hammering the 2 rotating villains. There will always be a rotating villain anytime there's a bill that they don't want to get passed. That's just how the corporations who fund both political parties work. And I think because we see them self-censor, and it's not just things like this, they self-censor on Julian Assange. Not one of them has spoken out about Julian Assange this year at all. when they self-censor on AOC saying, I defer to Democratic Party leadership on regime change operations in Venezuela. When it's things like that, where it's like they're clearly bowing down to the capitalist imperialists instead of challenging them head on, they don't look like a left-wing opposition. They look like Democrats. They look like they're indistinguishable. And so to me, it's like this, I get it. You want to get incremental reforms. And I agree that some of these incremental reforms, something's better than nothing. I agree with you about that. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, if we constantly accept the little reforms and we go along, walk in lockstep with the Democrats without calling them out enough, what we end up seeing is that a Republican looks at them, maybe an uninformed working class Republican, not like a kind of representative.
Yeah. No, I know.
They look at it and they think that AOC is indistinguishable from Nancy Pelosi.
Yes.
They call her Mama Bear and they prop her up.
This is the problem.
Independents see them as indistinguishable, and I think it's because they aren't making themselves oppositional. We want a Tea Party of the left. That's what the Greens, independents, people who are distrustful of the Democratic Party, we want them to act like a Tea Party. I don't even want to work for the Democratic Party. Like, I am outside. I'm not going back in personally. Mm-hmm. But at least if they're claiming to fight for the things that I also agree with, I want to see them be oppositional.
Yeah. I don't think that's unfair. I don't. There could be more of that, and there's not at this point, because the group of people who are, that harder left group is a dozen people. The power that they really hold isn't that significant. Their influence on, public discussion, in particular people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is much larger.
That's what I think is most important. Their influence on narrative is what I think is most important.
Well, something that I found interesting was there was a thing that CNN did a month or two ago, basically just like this interview with AOC. It was like an hour long. They put it in prime time on like a Friday night. Like, it was a big deal. They did a lot of promo for it, and I saw a lot of people on the the Jimmy Dore, the Green Party left, whatever you want to call them, complaining about that and being like, oh, here we go, she's just being propped up by corporations and she's a sellout and all this type of stuff. And it's like, no. For us to get somewhere, we have to get that attention from the mainstream media. So we're seeing right now with the strikes and what's going on with like John Deere and Kellogg's. I mean, the media, frankly, has been covering it pretty well, surprisingly, and they're covering it in a pretty positive way for the most part. And that's nice to see. That's going to help build our movement. When DSA is out there and they're bringing food to striking workers and bringing supplies, these local chapters in a lot of cases are, that's great. We're continuing to build that connection with working class people. Our politicians, people like AOC, last year, I remember she went out to a picket line in New York. I forget exactly for what, but she was out there with striking workers at one point. Cory Bush slept outside the Capitol building in protest of the eviction moratorium ending. These people are doing things, maybe they're not doing enough to some people, sure, but they are still doing things in opposition and certain things that have actually gotten things done. So
I agree when DSA does things like going to picket lines, when AOC and any of them go to picket lines and do things like that. That's objectively good. That's not something that I'm going to disagree with. You know what I mean? We agree on that. I'm of the belief that you can, no matter what I disagree with people on otherwise, if we agree on a single issue, I do think we should work on a single issue together. So I agree with them there. But I guess my problem with it is if they are not being fully transparent and open with the left, right? So DSA typically only endorses Democrats for Congress. They don't have open dialogue with the Green Party. And sometimes they do. Local chapters do. So I'll give an example of like DSA Baltimore. DSA Baltimore endorsed Franca Mueller-Paz, a Green Party candidate for city council in Baltimore. I thought that was good. That's objectively good in my opinion. But we don't see from the national, and we don't see like a consistent narrative. We don't see these DSA endorsed Democrats like AOC in the squad. We don't see them also talk about Green Party. So Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden both say America needs a strong Republican Party. They explicitly say it.
Yeah, that's stupid.
We don't hear AOC and the squad say a Gallup poll just showed 62% of Americans want a third party. And let's have dialogue with the Green Party. Let's have dialogue with PSL. Let's have dialogue with the People's Party. Because if you have dialogue, at least you are talking to us. At least these concerns that we're raising online, these concerns that we're talking about constantly, They ignore us. They don't talk to us. And so when I was at the March for Medicare for All in June or July, I tried to interview Cori Bush. And I asked her a question about how do you respond to your critics about force to vote. She actually wouldn't answer it on camera. And she called it manufactured division. And she just and that was how it was. And to me, it's like, and then Max Blumenthal asked her the same question at the Capitol protest 2 or 3 weeks after that. And they said, oh, well, we have no power to actually do anything like that. You did if you blocked Nancy Pelosi. Then she ended the interview. The aides got in the way. They shut it down. And so I guess my problem is that they claim to be fighting for us and the same things we want to fight for. And in some ways they are, but then they ignore us and act like we don't exist and just completely suppress our side. Because to me, it's like, I believe in communism. I believe in anarchism. And I also believe in socialism. I think that there's commonality with all three of these ideologies. There's differences, clear differences. But there's a lot of commonality. And to me, leftist solidarity means they should be standing in solidarity with the people to their left. And instead, they're standing more in solidarity with neoliberals who are not left.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess the thing with the Green Party for me is 30 years running, and there is not a lot to show for it. DSA, before Bernie Sanders ran for president, I believe had less than 5,000 members. Now there's 95,000. There's hundreds of people elected who are DSA members across the country at every level of government, local, state, and federal. And it's one of those things where the Green Party strategy of running a presidential candidate year after year, spending all these resources on this just to get 0.5% of the vote, maybe occasionally 1 or 2, has not created a lot of results. DSA already has shown results. Just over the last 5 years, they've shown massive growth, massive wins. And there's actual real progress being made.
So for the Green Party, the way I respond to them not having been successful yet, I think there's a lot of factors for that. I think focusing too much on national elections is a problem, but they don't just focus on national elections. They do run local candidates.
But they don't win at local levels either.
City council seats and things like that across the country. You just didn't hear about them. And to me, it's like they're up against so many systemic barriers, whether it's the spoiler effect, whether it's the media not covering them, whether it's them being smeared constantly. And the thing is, to me, is it's like the same people who claim to want a third party, but then they don't help the Greens in any way, shape, or form. I mean, DSA, I have an article that I could share. I'm going to put it in the comments after this. They were founded by people who were CIA informants. They were founded by people who worked with the CIA on things like the Vietnam War, on things like the Korean War. And they were anti-communist, explicitly anti-communist, people who founded the DSA. And the DSA, because they are connected intrinsically with the Democratic Party, who is connected intrinsically with the corporations, of course DSA is getting more airtime and more coverage. The CIA doesn't see them as a threat to the capitalism. So my thing is, it's like, if we could work together on building a true workers' party from the ground up, if people who claim to want this were working more with the left, who's been fighting for this for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, even W.E.B. Du Bois said that there's two parties, or there's one party by two names. Eugene Debs.
Yeah, the Debs
He also
quote.
talked about how both parties are corrupt. And so to me, it's like, the reason why DSA does as well as they do is because they work with imperialists. They are not that in the same DSA organization, because there are good people in DSA who do good work, but the elected officials are self-censoring on important issues to toe the Democratic Party line. And that's why they are doing better. Whereas if the Green Party was getting support from people like AOC, if DSA National was being consistently supportive of third parties and showing solidarity, they would do better. Because once they get to 5%, they can get more federal funding in the next campaigns. They get ballot access automatically. There are certain systemic barriers.
4 cycles. I've heard that for every cycle that I've been alive. If we can just get to 5%. Well,
people aren't supporting them.
Yeah.
People who believe in the things they claim to believe in, but then they support Democrats who are, again, capitalist imperialists, warmongering around the world, putting sanctions on countries around the world.
Sure. So I do want to mention a few things here with DSA real quick in relation to the Green Party. So you talked about the systemic barriers that the Green Party faces, which it absolutely does. It should be easier for third parties, I believe, in electoral reform and all of that. I think we should abolish the electoral college, proportional representation, all of that type of stuff for sure. I'm with that. However, right now, that's not the system we live in. And frankly, it's really hard to do election reform, right? So we have to work with what we have. The easiest way to win an election, the easiest way to get on the ballot is to either be a Republican or to be a Democrat. DSA generally takes the option of using the Democratic ballot line because it takes less signatures and less money to get on there. And depending on what level of government you're running for, if you win the Democratic nomination, the Democratic Party just gives you money. So,
but they're giving them corporate money. That's corporate money that the party's giving you.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it's not.
Don't speak out about Julian Assange. The president of the United States is persecuting a journalist who revealed war crimes, who revealed the rigging of the 2016 primary, and they are silent. That's how you inherently toe their line. That's why they're giving you money that's corporate money.
Here's my problem with the whole thing there. The DSA, since its founding, has had the goal of not being within one of the major parties. You can't just do that, though. You can't just make a third party and expect it to go somewhere. It's never worked before, and it probably never will.
But 60% of Americans want it. To say it never will is like a defeatist attitude. You're self-defeating in that way.
In my mind, it's self-defeating to say elections don't work. So
I'm not saying elections don't work. I'm not saying that they don't work. I'm saying that they're rigged and they're corrupt. I'm not saying that elections are bad and we should have a dictatorship. I'm saying that if they want to genuinely support these democracy reforms, they shouldn't just say, oh, well, this is just the way the system is, so we're just going to do this. No, actually fight to change it. Why doesn't AOC talk about the need for a third party? Why aren't they collaborating with the third parties to figure out exactly how we can make it happen?
Because people don't care.
But they don't care. That's what I'm saying. They don't care.
I'm not talking about politicians.
But they don't care about me.
I'm not talking about politicians here, though. I'm talking about just your average person. The average person cares about what is going on in their lives, what they have. Can they pay their bills? Can they, afford food? Can they go to the doctor? Can they do these things? Can they get time off from work? That's what people care about. So you can't go on national TV or hold rallies and get people all energetic about, getting rid of first past the post. It just doesn't work that way.
But you can for getting rid of the duopoly, though. 60% of Americans disagree with it. They want a third party. It's a popular movement.
You can, but you're not going to get the attention. And like you said, there's the systematic
AOC and Bernie have the platforms to definitely get the attention. And if they talk about Assange and the things that got revealed in 2016 and the way that the CIA wanted to assassinate Assange, I mean, Bernie could have broken the two-party system in 2016.
See, but Julian Assange is the same thing.
After that release came out, third parties had like 20% support in the polls. And Bernie, if he had done the third-party approach at that time, there was a policy window. There was a moment. He could have exploited that moment to break the two-party system. But what we see is they keep sheepdogging people back into the two-party system. And if that's our strategy, we never break it.
So Bernie Sanders was very clear, though, in 2016, after he decided to drop out, that his goal in that election was never to win. It was simply to push the Democratic Party to adopt more progressive policies. And that is precisely what they did. They have a much more progressive platform than they did 10, 15 years ago.
Actually, if you think about Medicare, though, Hillary Clinton was promising to lower the Medicare age to 55 in that campaign. Now, all of them are talking about 60. So it's like on healthcare, at least, we're actually to the right of where we were in 2016.
No,
and to me, voting for somebody like Hillary Clinton should be non-negotiable. Voting for somebody like Hillary Clinton, who supported regime change wars around the world, who supported austerity policies, so to me, it's like, why do we keep banging our heads against the wall with the two-party system when we know they're corrupt? They'll admit they're corrupt behind the scenes, but then publicly they act like they're all friends, and it's just one big club, and we're not in it.
Well, but they're not all corrupt. I mean, that's a.
I'm not saying that the squad necessarily is corrupt themselves. I'm saying that they are working with the people we know who are corrupt. We know that the party itself is corrupt, and they'd rather prop them up. I mean, Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, you could argue, definitely are corrupt, and they're propping them up. So it's like, how do we break the two-party system if we're operating within their confines? And especially, to me, it's like I said, I supported them trying to take over the party at one point. But to me, I expected them to act like an opposition trying to take it over from within. But if you're towing the narrative lines, you're not doing that.
Well, I mean, I think the best example is the Nevada Democrats. What DSA did in Nevada was they went in, they won all of the internal elections, and they took over the party. And now damn near every single person who is running the Nevada Democratic Party is a DSA member or a socialist or someone on the left in general. And that's great. I mean, we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep taking over these parties at the local and state level. We're going to continue to build that influence nationally. And we're going to continue to educate.
We're still not talking about the breaking the two-party system part. That's the part that never gets confronted in these conversations.
Because it's hard. It's decades away. If it's ever going to happen, it's decades away.
60% of Americans want this to happen. It doesn't have to be decades away. Even if they went out there and said, we want a third party, we want ranked choice voting and proportional representation. If they were explicitly saying these things consistently and having dialogue, if they were actually giving us a helping hand and saying, see, okay, even if they're not Greens, even if they don't change parties or anything like that, even if they were just having a conversation with Howie Hawkins, having a conversation with Jill Stein, they don't do it because they think that they're going to lose all their liberals if they do it.
Well, but why do it when we're talking about, at the end of the day, like, you can talk about how third parties poll at 10, 20, 30%, which they do, but they never actually get those votes because people know they're not going to get more than half a percent.
The media doesn't let them break through. The media purposely portrays them as if they're fringe, and people like Bernie and AOC have the platforms to lift them up out of that. AOC has 11 million followers on Twitter. If they were being antagonistic for that policy, it could actually get popular. People would actually hear about it. They couldn't suppress the information if they were breaking through, but instead they're just walking the line.
People like AOC are immensely popular with those liberal types, the View watchers. You know what I mean? She's very popular with those people, despite having basically the same politics as somebody like Bernie Sanders. That's why we kind of do have to work within the Democratic Party. Here's the thing: if we don't, we're not going to get those opportunities to go on CNN and promote our message. We're not.
They're elected representatives already. They definitely will get the opportunities. There's no way they can get suppressed.
So is Justin Amash still in office?
Did he run again? I don't know if he did.
He would have lost. So I've actually met Justin Amash.
But if they worked as five people, if five of them left the Democratic Party and joined the Greens, I don't think they would necessarily lose because they already have the popularity and they can call out all of the corruption of the party. Most Americans want Medicare for all. Joe Biden isn't giving it to us during a pandemic that killed 750,000 people. The Greens want to go further than Medicare for all. They want to have no profit motive in healthcare. Hospital beds have dropped like 800,000 beds since the 70s because of profit motive. But they're walking the line. They're not pushing for what we thought they were going to push for. They are playing it safe. And playing it safe, you never win. You never get the policies we really need. You get rolled in negotiations because people like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, they're willing to not play it safe. They're willing to antagonize Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. Who are actually on their side at the end of the day, so it's not even antagonistic.
You would ultimately, though, agree with the statement that I make that, 10, 15 years ago compared to now, the Democratic Party right now is more progressive than it was overall. You agree with that statement, right? Like the average person in the party, like someone like AOC wouldn't have been here 15 years ago.
I mean, right? I think definitely the average person in the party is more, but they're not left. They're still liberals. That's the thing. Left, there's still, if your DSA is basically muddying the waters of what socialism really is, because if you're hiding from communism, because they were born into anti-communism, that was the founding of DSA, and no indications show that they've changed off of that. They still act like it's something you can't touch with a 10-foot pole.
No, that's not true at all. So the reason
their PR is not at all about communism. They don't talk about communism at all in their PR.
I mean,
I'm sure in the conversations they do in their internal meetings.
Literally, just on the DSA homepage, you can find links to caucuses and whatnot that are communist. Like they're pretty open about it. But the reason DSA was founded with anti-communist roots, I believe there was this group. It was called the Student Defense League. I want to say is what it was
Something
called
like that. I don't
back in the 70s. And it was before DSA, one of the largest socialist organizations in the United States of America. And they ended up having a organizational split between revolutionary communists and reformists. And that group split up, and I think there was 2 or 3 subsequent groups that just kind of all fell apart. And so DSA was founded with that in mind, right? With this focus on reform, with this focus on elections. Over the years, however, DSA has certainly become a much bigger tent. There is, for example, the Bread and Roses Caucus, sorry, which is a Marxist caucus within DSA. It is still people supporting the broader DSA message that the goal is to, elect these people and improve people's material conditions on a, day-to-day basis, improve people's lives. But they're still Marxists. They still hold these more radical beliefs than most people in DSA, but they're okay with that because ultimately they know they're supporting something that is going to improve the lives of, the working class.
But is the Democratic Party really doing that, though?
Well, it's not about the Democratic Party. It's about DSA.
We're not making progress on Medicare for all. We're not making progress on wages. They're still sanctioning countries around the world, which causes the working class around the world to suffer, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Nicaragua, whether it's the North Korea, a whole ton of countries. They're sanctioning them and hurting their working class. And again, we don't see our actual DSA elected officials, the ones with the massive platforms, we don't see them raising these questions loudly enough. And I think and this comes down to the fundamental question of reform versus revolution, I think, because if we're on the reformist side and we're seeing how the reformist side has constantly played out for the past 40 years, 50 years, where the country, we've been talking about Medicare for all since the 90s and nothing's happening. And they're not fighting for it openly. So it's like, I'm of the belief personally, like, we need to be revolutionary because the American people are getting more and more impoverished and more upset, and the coronavirus made it worse. And I think, because even what they got at the Capitol Hill sit-in, the eviction moratorium extension was only 90% of the one before it, and that got knocked down by the courts. And now it's just being swept by the wayside. And it's like,
well, but this is again the importance of election.
To change the Constitution is what I think, because the Constitution itself is the real problem here, because it doesn't include the basic human rights that countries like even Kenya has the right to adequate housing in their constitution.
Sure. So, but that is a very hard thing to do. We'll
never get hard things if we don't try.
But we're talking about something that is so much farther beyond just trying to get a bill passed in Congress.
But we're not getting any bills. That's what I'm saying. It's so obstructionist and corporate controlled that we're not getting the things we need.
Right.
We can't. If we play this game forever, 30 years from now, we're going to wake up and we're going to be like those people 30 years ago who thought there was all this hope and then it didn't happen. We need to actually have these safeguards in the Constitution so that there can never be a conservative trying to deprive us of health care, so that there can never be a conservative trying to deny us living wages.
Well, but
it's not the Constitution, they can do it.
Back to the eviction moratorium thing real quick with the court striking it down. This is the importance of even getting liberals elected. And this is one of the areas where I absolutely do buy into the lesser of two evils narrative. Even a moderate liberal judge is infinitely better than people like Neil Gorsuch or Brett Kavanaugh. When you have people on the courts who straight up are going to oppose things like abortion, who are going to strike down a lot of labor rights and labor bills and stuff like that, who may rule in favor of corporations when it comes to like antitrust things and whatnot. That's not great. At least with even more moderate liberal judges who people like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden would appoint, you're still going to get generally favorable rulings for liberal policies. So when we don't invest time into making sure that Democrats control the Senate or the House or the presidency, we end up having, the Trump presidency, which appointed more judges than any other presidency in decades. So, I mean, there's still importance, even when it comes to bad people getting elected.
But that's the exact same trick they've been catching us on for decades. Malcolm X used to talk about how liberals are the people who will stab you in the back. Conservatives will come at you head on. Yeah. So we see what the conservatives are doing. They're not sneaky about it, but liberals are slippery. And because they pretend to be our friends, they can do conservative things and get away with it.
Mhm.
You know, that, like I said earlier, W.E.B. Du Bois saying that it's one party by two names.
That's-
We can't break if we don't ever break out of that holding pattern. It's good cop, bad cop, and
So
we can't let them do that to us forever.
also
At
that
some point, we have to demand a multi-party democracy, because otherwise, I mean, other countries. I'm in Sweden right now. Sweden has like 8 political parties. They have proportional representation,
Yeah.
and that's a good thing. We should have too.
absolutely.
But we have a party like the Greens here, where the Greens only get 4 or 5% support, but they are the kingmakers in the coalition government.
Mhm.
They get to be the ones who decide whether it's a left or right coalition. They always go with the left.
Right.
And so it's like, that's how you actually give smaller voices more representation. But with the approach that you're talking about, the approach you're defending of the lesser of two evils, it suppresses us and ignores us, and we have no right to vote. It's not a democracy in America. And if we accept that we don't live in a democracy, then what? So we're just going to say it's okay to not live in a democracy forever?
Well, it's not that we don't live in a democracy.
It's an oligarchy. Bernie Sanders said it.
It
It's
is.
an oligarchy.
No, we're on the same page there. We are on the same page there. This is a country ruled by corporations. This is a country ruled by the rich. And our government is, for the most part, bought and paid for by those interests. But that's the whole point of DSA from the beginning has always been to build this coalition, this group within the Democratic Party, and eventually create our own third party. It's not going to work just doing it the way the Green Party does it, and that's why I support the DSA. Eventually, it's going to.
It's like you're cutting off your head to spite your tail, because
it's never worked before.
We're losing trust in DSA over them collaborating with CIA Democrats.
Nobody's losing trust in DSA. DSA's membership has plateaued. We're not.
There are people who already don't trust us in the first place in the working class.
There are people
who don't trust the Democratic Party. There's a lot of people who don't trust the Democratic Party.
There are people who
are not calling out the Democratic Party. They're working with the corrupt Mama Bear Democratic Party. So it's like, if you're working with the corrupt people and you're not distinguishing yourself clearly from them.
Sure.
I mean, it's like, we have to, like you're saying, you're basically defending them, not calling out the fact. They're saying protect our democracy. They're not saying give America a democracy. They're saying protect our democracy. Ignoring the fact that the Democratic Party sued the Greens off of like 4 state ballots. Ignoring the fact that they suppress our voices constantly, and then they pretend it's democracy.
The whole point of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was to get more people.
There was things in the Voting Rights Act that would have suppressed third parties even more. The For the People's Act?
For the People Act, not the John Lewis. Yeah.
Public funding. I don't remember what was in specifically that one, but there's been 2 voting rights bills this year that include provisions that make it harder for third parties to compete. And we don't get heard about that.
It would also make it easier for most people to vote. So,
but the 2 parties that are corporate controlled.
Ultimately, those bills would have benefited DSA. So, I mean, they benefit the
Democratic Party. You're defending
what benefits the Democratic Party benefits us.
Suppressing third party voters.
It's not.
You're
not suppressing third party voters.
It's a Trojan horse to suppress us more.
It's not necessarily defending suppressing third party voters. It's that there is no third party that has ever gotten any level of support just
because people like you help us. Because people like you suppress us. You help the capitalists suppress us. That's the thing. People have been fighting for this for 30 years, 40 years, and they've heard this argument from people like you for 40 years. When do we get democracy? When do we get our right to vote?
No.
Why is every voting rights bill not including us in the conversation? That's the problem.
I have no problem voting. I go and I check the box and I put it in. I vote. Seems like, I mean, I don't know what your problem is.
Don't vote. The Greens were sued off of 4 state ballots by the Democratic Party. The public fund, their corporate parties get all of their money from all these big corporate donors. Greens rely on small donations from small donors. They rely on the public matching funds. One of those voting rights bills this year would have lifted the requirement to get that matching funds to an almost unreachable level for third parties. And so it's like, you're constantly defending the approach of the people who are undemocratically suppressing us instead of lifting up our voices.
I mean, DSA is the largest socialist organization in American history. We are the voice.
2% of the population deserves representation.
The Green Party doesn't have a single federal person in office. But
do you see how you're
DSA does? No.
Undemocratic behavior.
Here's the deal.
You're defending undemocratic behavior.
No, I'm not. DSA is the national voice of the left. We are the status quo right now of the left. The Green
What
Party
does
is no
that have to
longer
do with
that.
the voting rights bill that lifts public funding requirements to an unreachable level for third parties? What does that have to do with the fact that we're not allowed on the debate stages to a national audience?
That
You're not
bill grows our party. That bill will grow our party. That bill would help DSA
The DSA is not our party. The DSA is not our party. That's the thing. We are Greens. We are PSL. We are Communist Party. We are to the left of the DSA. We don't collaborate with CIA Democrats. And you're defending undemocratic behavior.
It's not even 1% of voters, man. I mean, why would I don't care?
1% of voters matters, don't they? Even 1% of voters, you're defending them suing us off of state ballots. You're defending undemocratic behavior because 1% of the population. Well, you know what? Aren't trans people like 1 or 2% of the population? Don't they matter? For example, coronavirus. How many people have died from coronavirus this year? 800,000.
Did you just compare being a Green Party member to being trans?
800,000 people died from coronavirus. How many votes did Howie Hawkins get in the last election? Like 1.2 million, 1.3 million? More people vote Green Party than have died from coronavirus in the United States. But they don't matter?
Great, but it's not that they don't matter. It's that the policies that DSA supports and what DSA people want to implement will benefit them too, just like they'll benefit every other working class American.
But you don't really
whether you realize it.
You don't really believe in democracy.
I mean, you can go and vote for the Green Party all you want, but if you're still only getting 0.5% of the vote, you're still only getting 0.5% of the vote.
Why aren't you calling out the suppression that is happening that prevents us from gaining more traction, from getting attention from people?
But what suppression?
You're defending a party that sues us off the ballots.
So why were they sued off the ballots?
For things like Angela Davis had moved from one house to another in a different neighborhood in the same city, and because she put her address as the old address and then moved after the registration, they said that was a technicality. There was like 3 or 4 technicalities they used to sue us off the ballots.
Yeah, those invalid signatures. Yeah, that's what that happens to everyone, man.
That was a change of an address. Like, again, you don't care about how third parties operate in the system.
Look,
you basically say, oh, you're 1% of the population. I know that more people vote Green than died of coronavirus, but I don't care about your votes. That's what you're saying.
But that's a weird comparison anyways. But
how is that a weird comparison? That's numbers. That's pure numbers.
The whole point of it is that there has been no progress that the Green Party, PSL, or any of these other
people like you don't help us. People like you who claim to care about us, you don't help us.
Yeah,
you're defending voter suppression is what you're doing. Just because we're 1% of the population, we don't deserve a right to vote, is what you're saying.
We don't
deserve representation in our political system.
You can vote for whoever you want, and you do. I mean, if you can't put together a campaign that gets more than 0.5% of the vote, then that's on you, brother. I don't know what you want. Like, I don't know what we're supposed to do. Like, yeah, sure, it'd be great to get rid of first past post. It'd be great to have proportional representation. But
have DSA electeds talk about it. Have DSA electeds talk to us.
Yeah,
have us work together on these things, because I'm willing to work with you all on those things. Kashana Sawant is in the DSA. There are third-party people who care about the same things DSA does. We can collaborate on these things instead of going, oh, you're just 1% of the population, we don't care. Work together, compromise on that issue.
That's great, but to actually get that done, we would have to have 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate. Good luck with that. That's not going to happen. That's so far down the line. We're not going to get to the point of being able to do.
What needs to get 2/3? What are you saying?
There's bills to get rid of
from Jamie Rashkin, for example, to get proportional representation, ranked choice voting. Why aren't we talking about that bill more?
To get rid of, for example, the Electoral College, you have to do a constitutional amendment. So you have to go through that process. There are certain voting things.
What's keeping third parties out? That's something that's.
I mean, it would.
That's not what we're talking about here.
If a presidential candidate from the Libertarian Party or the Green Party or whatever did become competitive at the national level, it would 100% prevent them from winning.
Because
you have to get to 270.
Why talking about things like ranked choice voting consistently? Why aren't they? You're not answering that.
I mean, that's what I was explaining earlier. Was when you're going to a rally, you're not doing a rally about ranked choice voting. It doesn't get the people going.
You could talk about that.
I mean, yeah, you can mention it, and I'm sure if you go on our website, you can find something about it. I mean,
they don't throw a bone in our direction at all, though. They could sit down with Howie Hawkins and say, Howie, we agree that you deserve some representation in Congress. We agree that you guys deserve your right to vote. We want you to help us with this voting rights legislation, how can we make it easier for third parties to compete?
Well, but as a DSA member, elevating the Green Party is not beneficial to us. We have no reason to do that. I mean, that's just lifting up a different leftist group that ultimately is competing for the same supporters.
Democracy is beneficial to all of us. So you're saying you only care about the DSA portion of the working class?
I believe that DSA offers the best solutions to the problems the working class faces, and I don't think it's worth anybody's time promoting.
What about the working class that doesn't trust the Democratic Party? What about the 60% of the working class that wants a third party? What about them?
When the DSA strategy does eventually get us Medicare for all and universal college and all these other things.
You realize we are helping in that movement too. It's not the DSA strategy that'll be giving you those.
March for Medicare for all. Yeah. For those things, right? I remember when during the March for Medicare for all, they went to the wrong person's office. I thought that was pretty funny. But
why? I don't see why you're being hostile towards people who agree with you on fighting for Medicare for all.
Well, people who agree but also support things like force the vote and then talk about it a year later for some reason. Like, it's one of those things
because we're about to lose Medicare expansion out of this bill, and when you start from a position of compromise, you get rolled into compromise.
But
they should start from the position of fighting for it.
If you're sitting there listening to folks like Jimmy Dore and Ryan Knight, guess what's going to happen? Of course, they're never going to be satisfied with anything the Democratic Party does. That's what they do. They create outrage. That's their entire brand. So they'll never be satisfied. They'll always feed you guys the narrative. And since the same is true with people like Jill Stein and Howie Hawkins, Gloria, whatever the fuck her name is.
Do you see how you're showing more solidarity with capitalist, imperialist warmongers who are persecuting and investigative journalists?
That's what I'm talking about. You'll never be satisfied.
You're showing more solidarity with neoliberals than you are with socialists, communists, and anarchists. That is not socialist solidarity.
Policy-wise,
that is solidarity with the bourgeoisie is what you're doing.
No. Policy-wise, we across the board will agree on 98% of things. Here's the deal, though.
So why are you attacking us? Why are you attacking us and defending neoliberal suppression?
Because those strategies are a dead-end path, and they always have been, and they always will be in this current system. You acknowledged yourself that there are systemic barriers that third parties face, and those systemic barriers
don't shit on us. Help us lift them.
DSA's goal is to basically do the exact same thing in a different way. But there are people with their own organizations and their own personal brands who only have their own best interests to look out for. The only reason Jimmy Dore gets any relevance is because he manufactures outrage. Force the vote was just made up out of thin air for fun, for clicks. And that's what Jimmy Dore does. So, like, that's what he's done for 30 fucking years. Like, I don't
realize you're disrespecting people, not just Jimmy Dore. I'm not talking about Jimmy Dore. There have been people who've been fighting for democracy in America since W.E.B. Du Bois, since Eugene Debs, and you're basically saying that our perspective that working within the corporate capitalist duopoly that's perpetuating war around the world, you're saying that we are making up narratives when these are our political, ideological worldviews. This is actually genuinely what we feel in our hearts. We are operating to the left of DSA. We're operating to the left of the Democratic Party. And again, socialist solidarity, leftist solidarity, Marxist solidarity is showing solidarity with all of the working class. That includes people who are not Democrats. That includes people who are not DSA. But what you were saying is that
there's actually
our opinions don't matter. We're just making things up. I don't really care about Medicare for all. Savage Joy, she cried about how she's 85% blind at the March for Medicare for All. She was talking about how important force the vote was to her because she's desperate to get health care as soon as possible. And you're saying that we're just making it up?
Yeah, you know what? You want to know that
you are not showing solidarity at all.
Yeah, no, you want to know the shitty thing about the force the vote stuff? It's because people like that who, have these terrible health problems that they can't really afford to treat, they heard about force the vote. And they heard about how, these people pushing this idea that, if these progressive, they just really pushed hard, they could get it. And they sold these people who want universal healthcare and they need universal healthcare. They sold them a false narrative. And they convinced them that force the vote, this is the path. And they convinced them, and they messed with these people emotionally. They manipulated them. That's what
This is
this
how
is.
politics works. You use leverage as a block
Yeah,
to
you
push forward
manipulate
your
disabled
policy
people.
priorities. That's what Joe Manchin's doing. That's what Kirsten Sinema is doing. But instead, we have Pramila Jayapal saying, oh, Biden, the inspirer-in-chief, Biden, the closer, while we're about to get a bill that's $2 trillion that you admit started off at $10 trillion. So you're admitting that we're not getting the
We're out of
priority
Afghanistan.
that we're watering down bills with their strategy because they're appeasing the Democratic Party. They're not showing solidarity with the leftists fighting wholeheartly for Medicare for all. You're saying we're making shit up.
Yeah, I am. So the Biden administration has gotten us out of Afghanistan, which is, in my opinion, completely worth it.
They just signed an agreement with Pakistan to continue drone warfare in Afghanistan. That's not the end of the war. It's not over. It's not over. I just told you evidence. Do you want me to pull up the evidence that we're continuing drone warfare in Afghanistan?
We're also not going to dismantle the military-industrial complex overnight. So I am thrilled that American troops. It's not a goal of his.
He doesn't even say he wants to do that. He agrees with the war on terror.
I am thrilled that American troops are out of Afghanistan. I'm thrilled that it is not our problem.
What about
anymore.
the Afghani civilians that are going to get killed in drone strikes? What about them?
Well, that's bad. Obviously, I'm not sitting here saying we should do drone strikes.
But the war's not over, though. The war's not over.
Well, we should stop doing drone strikes, but it's not. We're not going to be losing American lives anymore in wars that are pointless, and that's good.
Do you care more about American lives than Afghani lives, though?
I care about my neighbors more than I necessarily do somebody halfway across the globe, and I think that's fair. I think it's fair to care more about your own community and wanting your own community to be as good as it can be.
But do you see how this is something we talk about a lot? I'm gonna tone myself down.
Sure.
A lot of people, when they talk about Sweden, where I am now, they talk about how the privileges that they enjoy, which is really cheap healthcare, free college, things like that. That wealth was built on imperialism. That wealth was built on wealth that we've extracted from the third world, from developing countries.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying, though, by supporting the Democratic Party and the incrementalist reforms they give us while continuing sanctions on Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, countries around the world, antagonizing for war still, you're saying that it's okay if they give us little piecemeals here in America and little compromises here in America because we care more about our neighbors than we do about the people that we're abusing around the world. That's what the Democratic Party approach is bringing us to.
Both things are ultimately important, but I think when it comes to eliminating the stigma around the word socialism in the United States of America, I think it's good for us to first tackle these things that will obviously are already very popular. Like universal healthcare, and focus on those, associate those things with ourselves before we start tackling these more controversial things. It is hard to do anything with the military in terms of cutting and not look bad just because of how the establishment runs things, right?
But do you see how that's a neoliberal approach? Because
what I'm saying is
socialism and communism is global proletarian revolution.
I understand.
Working class solidarity across borders around the world. But you're saying right now that imperialism should take a back seat because we have to focus on helping the American people while we continue hurting the working class of other countries. That's what supporting the Democratic Party does.
It's not necessarily about supporting imperialism. I would say it's more so about we as socialists have to rebuild the brand. And that is kind of weird to say as a socialist, but there is obviously still this.
It's exactly what the DSA said in the 70s when they supported the war in Vietnam. That's the exact same things they said.
But here's what I'm trying to explain. There's still this great big Cold War holdover stigma about the words socialism and communism. We have to do whatever we can to get rid of that. And if that means sacrificing certain things, for example, I've been a big advocate, especially over the last few years, that I think the left should embrace American gun culture, for example. I don't think that's an issue that we can really tackle. I think guns are fine. I think guns are good. And I think if people want guns, they should be able to have guns. And I think if socialists want to get rid of this, we're all about control, narrative that obviously isn't real. And we want to be, more associated with freedom and liberty and stuff like that. There's certain things we're going to have to sacrifice, right? And I think guns are one of those. It's not about supporting imperialism and stuff like that. It is just.
But they are when they
building
support the
a
Democratic Party
brand.
and don't speak out about imperialist goals, though.
I
They
get
are
it, but
sacrificing that.
it's hard because the Green Party is a, I admire principled people. I don't necessarily agree with the approach of most of the Green Party people, but I admire that you are principled, that you're going to hold your views, that your views are what they are, and you're going to be consistent throughout. I admire that for sure. I get that. But at the end of the day, to actually make progress in politics, there comes a time to make sacrifices, I guess. And as somebody who has been involved in politics for all of not just my adult life but even my teenage life, I've seen this, and I've experienced the same crushing defeats you have, with Bernie and at even the local level and stuff like that. So I see that sometimes, hey, we got to make compromises to make some progress. And I guess I'm just more comfortable with that than you guys are.
So let's take it back to before the end of slavery in the 1850s.
Yep. Okay.
Frederick Douglass, he supported a third party
that
got 2% of the vote. One election, they even got 0.5% of the vote.
Yeah.
But because those 0.5% of people, because those 2% of people were willing to say, no, I'm not going to compromise on slavery. That is non-negotiable for me. It ended up getting co-opted by the major parties, and it became mainstream. Same thing with the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was being spoken about by the Green Party before AOC or anybody else had talked about it.
Yeah.
And now it's becoming mainstream.
Correct.
And so the whole point is if they are not willing to talk about these justice issues that we clearly care about, that are clearly important, they're not helping them go mainstream. They are being the person who compromises, and they're being the person not just who compromise. I'm okay with compromise, but my point is if you're not explicitly calling out the injustice, you are on the side of the injustice.
Well, I'm pretty sure.
The point is they're not. They can fight for what they say and fight really hard, and then electorally at some point a compromise might happen. But if you're not even saying the right thing, if they have sacrificed Medicare for all this year to talk about Medicare expansion, and we're not even going to get that, you have to start in a negotiation from a strong position so that when we get that compromise, it ends up being the right position. Yeah. But instead, when they start from a position of compromise, what we see is it ends up on the wrong side of things.
Sure. I will say, too, that I think my voice is echoing through, by the way.
I can't tell.
Oh, okay. It sounds weird.
It must be your side.
Okay. But I guess the big thing there is remind me. Topic.
Compromise.
Compromise. Right. So when people like AOC and stuff like that are bringing things to the mainstream, we have to remember we're not currently in an election year, so we're not having politicians go on TV, running ads, doing all these things, talking about policy. Last year we were. And so we saw a lot more political talk and a lot more policy talk because there's people running for office. So these people, if you go on AOC or Bernie or Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib or any of these more progressive politicians' website, they're still going to have things about Green New Deal and Medicare for all and all these very progressive policies.
But how can we trust if they're not going to fight for it? If they say they believe something to get our votes, but then in exchange for our votes, we get Joe Biden's policy and we get Joe Biden's narrative even from them, then they're not actually representing us and what they say they support on their platform. They are supporting the neoliberal compromise.
But much of the bill is a compromised version of more progressive policies. I mean, that's just the reality of it. You're dealing with one senator who owns a coal company for some reason and another senator who is just batshit crazy. So, it's one of those things where you're going to have to make some compromises that suck just because the circumstances we're in.
But they don't even
marginal improvement. But they did. So, I mean, Joe Biden is the one who's starting, right? He was the president. He is the one who proposed to build back better.
But they don't have to walk in lockstep with the president.
No,
they can walk in lockstep with their policy.
It is the president's job to present his agenda and his budget for the year. That is where everyone starts every single year, no matter what. So yeah, I'm sure progressives saw the original $10 trillion bill and still had a few things that they were upset about. And I'm sure now progressives see the current bill, which I believe is around $2 trillion, and go, wow, this is ass. And I agree, but there's still marginal improvement in it. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to squeeze a lot out of Manchin and Sinema. We just have to hope.
But that's the rotating villain strategy they're going to hit us with every time. Rotating villain always happens.
Yeah.
That's how to prevent us from getting the things we need.
Right.
We need our own. The left needs their own rotating villains. The left needs their own people willing to step out of line and say, no, I will not vote for this bill because they want to deprive all of the American people of health care. They're claiming we're the ones blocking progress. We're the ones who want all people to have health care. They're the people who only want 5% of people to have health care more.
Right.
And so we have to spin the narratives back on them. We can't let them dominate the conversation. The capitalists are dominating these negotiations.
Well, yeah, because they control everything. I mean, the capitalist class already controls everything. They control the media, obviously.
Why don't we have any
most
politicians?
politicians?
We don't have any
it's
representation. They're acting like liberals.
Well, it's not that they're acting like liberals. There's no question that people like Bernie Sanders are more progressive than most people in Congress, if not all of them. Like, I don't understand what you mean by acting like liberals. Yeah, there's going to be certain things
because they're out there calling Biden the inspirer in chief.
You're talking about one
watered down policies from the beginning instead of fighting for Medicare for all from the beginning.
Well, it's not about supporting watered down policies from the beginning. It's, hey, the president proposed this. Do you like it?
I'm not talking about the reconciliation bill. I'm talking about earlier this year when we could have been fighting for Medicare for all and we aren't.
But it wouldn't have passed still. And we don't need to go back.
But we would have had attention to it. We would have pushed back on Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden's agenda. They set the tone that we are going to play nice with you guys. We're not going to fight for our agenda. We're not going to fight for the things that our representatives, our constituents vote us this year for. We're going to support Biden's agenda the whole time.
But Bernie ran 2 campaigns to get these policies.
Just because you lost a presidential campaign doesn't mean you can't run.
I'm not saying that
you can't run on the things you ran on in your congressional seat, your Senate seat.
No. What I'm saying is Bernie Sanders took these ideas that had somewhat fallen out of the mainstream when he decided to run. And he took them and he made them very popular. And now it is our job to make sure we don't lose the goodwill that we have created. We know that the majority of Democratic voters support Medicare for all. We know the majority of Democratic voters support tuition-free college. We know the majority of Democratic voters support.
Who would you lose voters?
Let me explain. Let me explain this though. We know the majority of Democratic voters support these more radical left, not even leftist policies, frankly, social democratic policies that are still infinitely better than where we are now, right? We know the majority of Democratic voters support that. We also know the majority of Democratic voters are cool still voting for people like Kyrsten Sinema, Nancy Pelosi, these more corporate Dems, right? Even though they support these more progressive policies, that's voters. So we don't want to lose that goodwill that we have with this voter base who's still cool voting for whoever.
But how do you lose goodwill if 90% of them support Medicare for all? Just because they're voting for people who don't stand in their best interest, people vote for all sorts of reasons. It's not usually like when they vote for somebody like Kyrsten Sinema or Joe Manchin, it's just the name they know, the Democrat on the ballot, the person they're. But that's not necessarily because of opposing Medicare for all. 90% of them support it. You're not alienating any of the working class by fighting for Medicare for all. You're alienating the leadership. You're alienating the corporations. And that's what they're doing by not fighting for those things.
What I'm saying is that it is easier to alienate somebody by making it appear as if you're trying to divide the Democratic Party than it is to take a stand on policy.
60% of Americans want to divide the two-party system.
Well, that's great, but it's not gonna happen.
Nobody's trying it. They never try our strategy. That's the thing. You say it doesn't work. That's because the people who actually have a chance to make it work are not helping make it work. That's why. They could try. Imagine if they all pulled a Justin Amash. The squad all pulled Justin Amash and switched to the Green Party and said, we're going to vote in this type of way as a block from now on. We don't know what would happen. It hasn't happened. They've never done it. We've never had somebody as well known and popular as them actually try that.
So, but what the result of that ultimately could be just all of them losing their next election, and then we have
the result would be, I think, a complete fracture in the Democratic Party and a multi-party system developing out of it.
But it's still ultimately it's a gamble, because my read on it would be that the exact opposite. It would completely fracture the Democratic Party, and it would probably put Republicans in power for the next 20 years. That's my read on it. And so
I mean, right now we put the Republicans in power across the country with this milquetoast liberalism.
I mean,
and they're playing the game. We're talking in circles now. I get it. We've seen our disagreements. We know where we both stand. They spend a little more than an hour. I'm basically done. You're done. We've talked. We're going to beat a dead horse if we keep talking in circles about this. We know where our disagreements are now. We know where our agreements are. I do think it's good working with. I like how DSA works with unions. I like how DSA organizes for certain issues like that. The big beef is supporting the duopoly and not. And your imperialism comments really rubbed me the wrong way earlier. A lot of people in the comments rubbed the wrong way about that.
That's fair.
Kind of the DSA Western privilege statement. But
I know. I know how people are going to frame things because I'm used to that. I'm not too concerned about it. I think I will just say with DSA is what you make it. Every chapter, there are chapters that are liberal as fuck and they suck, and then there are chapters that will, every weekend read Mao together. So I know the San Francisco DSA, I think it was, had some controversy because they had a whole series where they were just reading a bunch of Mao, and everybody was kind of, the more moderate people in DSA were like, no, don't do that, but who cares? But yeah, DSA is what you make it. If you join a local chapter and you don't really worry about the DSA national stuff, just focus on your community and your group. And yeah, it just becomes what you want. A lot of them just do mutual aid stuff. A lot of them just do food banks and stuff like that. So it's just one of those things. I know one of them didn't adopt a highway here in Michigan, stuff like that. So it's just one of those things. I think they're good. I think they're making real progress. Big organization. So I think we're heading in the right direction as a group. So.
Well, Steve, it's been an interesting conversation. No personal hard feelings. I know I get kind of heated sometimes when I have policy disagreements. Yeah. Not you. It's the ideas, right? So.
Absolutely.
It's been good talking to you today, Steve.
For sure.
That's our episode of the Pro Peace Report today. Peace out, guys.